Hi everyone, my name is Saili and today I'll be presenting a review paper authored by Amar Shekoni, Cameron Brandon and Chris. This is a topic that sits at the intersection of innovation, ethics, and clinical need, which is pediatric neuromodulation. Specifically, I'll be talking about the gap in FDA approval for neuromodulation devices used in children and efforts being made to bridge that gap. So here's what I'll be covering today. I'll start by explaining what neuromodulation is, then dive into why pediatric access is limited and how off-label use fills the gap. We'll look at the barriers to FDA approval, current efforts to bridge that gap, and wrap up with the limitations and future outlook for pediatric neuromodulation. So, before we dive into device-specific challenges, let's start with a quick overview. Neuromodulation devices are devices that interact with neural tissue, either peripherally or centrally, through electromagnetic or pharmacological means to alter nerve activity for therapeutic purposes. Neuromodulation devices like deep brain stimulator, a spinal cord stimulator, vagus nerve stimulator are approved for adults, but most aren't approved for children, even though these same conditions often occur in both populations. Because of this, pediatric use often falls into the off label category, which is common but not ideal. That's partly due to ethical complexities in pediatric trials, small patient populations, and a lack of financial incentive for companies to pursue pediatric approval. So, the goal of this paper and this talk is to explore why this gap exists and what can be done to overcome it. So, let's take a second to clarify what off label use actually means, since it plays such a big role in pediatric neuromodulation. It refers to a medical device outside of its FDA approved conditions. That could mean for a different age group than approved.
好拉屎，对不起，对不起。
Okay. Example, using a neuromodulation device meant for adults in children for a different condition than approved. Example, using a DBS for Tourette syndrome when it is only approved for dystonia or in a different way than specified in the FDA approval. Example, adjusting stimulation parameters beyond what the device manufacturer recommends. So, as shown here, off label use brings both benefits and risks. On the benefit side, off label use provides expanded treatment options, sometimes when nothing else works. It has life saving potential, especially in severe epilepsy or dystonia. And importantly, it can generate real world data that supports future FDA approvals. Now, while the benefits like expanded access and life saving potential are real, it's important to understand that off label use isn't ideal. Off label use has become the default for many pediatric neuromodulation cases. But while it helps fill a treatment gap, it comes with serious drawbacks. First, these devices were never tested in children. That means we don't fully know how safe they are, how well they work, and how they affect a child's developing brain over time. Also, the physical size of these devices is designed for adults. As children grow, things like electrodes can shift or stretch, which increases the risk or complications like lead migration, infections, or repeat surgeries. And ethically, it's tricky because a child cannot truly consent. Parents are often faced with a dilemma. Do they wait and risk worsening symptoms or try an unapproved option and hope for the best? So, even if they decide to go ahead, insurance might not cover it, which can leave families facing enormous out of pocket costs. Lastly, off label doesn't really push the system forward. It allows companies and regulators to delay pediatric trials because doctors are already improvising in real time. In other words, it treats the symptoms but doesn't really fix the system. So, while it's often necessary, off label use should be seen as a workaround and not a solution. So, Neuromodulation has been explored for centuries, but it has only become a practical clinical tool in the 1990s with DBS for movement disorders. Since then, adult use has expanded rapidly, but pediatric use hasn't kept pace, even though the same conditions like epilepsy and chronic pain affect children too. The problem isn't that these therapies don't work in kids, it's the access is limited due to lack of pediatric approvals. That leaves children, especially those with drug resistant conditions, with fewer options or more invasive ones. So, this isn't about lack of demand, it's about a gap in approval, evidence, and infrastructure. To better understand the access gap we are about to explore, let's first get familiar with the main neuromodulation technologies currently used in clinical practice. So, DBS, which is deep brain stimulation, is an open loop system that continuously stimulates the brain without feedback. It is mostly used for movement disorders like Parkinson's and dystonia. In contrast, RNS, which is responsive neurostimulation, is a closed loop system. It detects seizure activity and delivers stimulation in real time, making it especially useful for epilepsy. Now, both are effective, but only DBS for dystonia has pediatric FDA approval. RNS remains off label in children. Spinal cord stimulation disrupts pain signals in the spine and is used for chronic back and leg pain, sometimes off label in kids. About peripheral nerve stimulation, it targets specific nerves near the pain source, commonly used in adults for migraines or nerve injuries. Neither is FDA approved for pediatric use, even though both are being used as off label in adolescents with pain. VNS is one of the few neuromodulation devices with pediatric FDA approval. It involves a lead wrapped around the vagus nerve and a pulse generator implanted in the chest. It's also being explored for depression, and unlike DBS or RNS, VNS doesn't require brain surgery, making it more accessible. So, here's how DBS and RNS approvals have evolved over time. DBS was first approved in 1997 for tremor, then expanded to Parkinson's, dystonia, and OCD through humanitarian device exemption pathway. RNS was introduced in 2013 for drug-resistant epilepsy, is the first FDA-approved closed-loop system. So over 160,000 DBS devices have been now implanted globally, and newer systems can even respond to the brain activity like RNS. So now that we have looked at the timeline of neuromodulation approvals, here's a breakdown of the devices that are FDA approved and how that translates or doesn't into pediatric use. You will notice that although many of these devices have been around for decades, like spinal cord stimulators since 1984 and VNS and DBS since the late 1990s, very few actually carry FDA approval for pediatric populations. All of these only two devices have formal pediatric approval, which are DBS and VNS. The rest, including RNS, spinal cord, peripheral, and sacral nerve stimulators, are all off-label when used in children, and even though they're frequently used in adolescents with conditions like drug-resistant epilepsy or chronic pain. So, as mentioned earlier, the two devices that are FDA approved are DBS and VNS. To be specific, DBS is approved under humanitarian device exemption pathway for primary dystonia in children aged 7 and above since 2002. It's the only FDA approved disease specific DBS used in pediatrics. VNS, on the other hand, received FDA approval in 2017 for treating drug resistant epilepsy or DRE in children as young as 4 years old via the traditional pre market approval pathway. So, for a child with epilepsy, VNS is currently the only FDA approved on label option. Devices like RNS and DBS for epilepsy will remain adult only. And also for children under the age of 4, no neuromodulation devices are FDA approved. So, due to this lack of approved options, doctors frequently use adult neuromodulation devices off label in children. it is seen that about 70% of unmet medical device needs relate to pediatrics. For example, DBS is used off label for Tourette's, movement disorders, and even dystonia in kids under 7. RNS and VNS are increasingly used off label for drug resistant epilepsy, including generalized epilepsy. Spinal cord stimulators and peripheral nerve stimulators are used in adolescents with chronic pain, although most of the evidence is case based and primarily those over age 10. Younger children are less often studied due to difficulty in pain assessment. Even for bladder and bowel dysfunction, sacral nerve stimulation is showing promise in children, but it is still used off label. So, we have seen that most neuromodulation devices used in children are off label, and that's not by choice, but because there are major barriers to getting pediatric FDA approved, devices FDA approved. So, let's walk through what those barriers are. First barrier is regulatory. Most neuromodulation devices are class 3, meaning they're high risk and require intensive pre market approval trials. But pediatric trials adds an extra layer. They must meet very strict ethical and scientific standards, especially when children are involved. Uh, Talking about infrastructure, even when a trial is planned, most hospitals don't have the right infrastructure, like pediatric specific institutional review boards, research coordinators trained in pediatric trials, or centralized data systems. Plus, pediatric trials often require multiple sites, which drives up costs and complexity. Talking about ethical barriers, children cannot legally consent. And even when parents do, trials still require the child's assent or affirmation. That's especially difficult if the child has neurological or development disorders. Uh, Also, talking about epidemiological barriers, the conditions that require neuromodulation in kids are rare. So, for example, less than 0.6% of US children have epilepsy, and not all of them are the candidates. So, this makes it hard to recruit enough patients to power a clinical trial. Next barrier is clinical and technical. So most devices are built for adult bodies. They don't fit children well. So as children grow, electrodes can shift or fracture. Devices may need to be replaced or revised, and the developing brain's neuroplasticity makes responses unpredictable, both in a good and a bad way. And then finally, financial barriers. So the return on investment is really low. So the pediatric market is small, reimbursement rates for pediatric procedures are even lower, and the cost for pediatric R&D is quite high. So most companies are reluctant to pursue pediatric specific development. So the gap in pediatric access isn't because neuromodulation doesn't work. It's because the system makes it extremely difficult, expensive, and ethically complex to prove that it works in children through the formal approval process. So, despite the barriers we just discussed, the FDA has developed several programs specifically to encourage pediatric device development. The first is humanitarian use device and humanitarian device exemption pathways, which allow devices for rare conditions affecting fewer than 8,000 people per year to be approved based on safety and probable benefit, not fully efficacy. This is how DBS for dystonia in children aged 7 plus was approved in 2002. Uh, the next program is Breakthrough Devices Program. So this program is for devices that addresses life-threatening or irreversible conditions like drug-resistant epilepsy. Companies access to expedited feedback, frequent FDA interaction, and study design guidance, all of which are extremely helpful for pediatric developers. TPLC, which is Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program. This program focuses on the entire product lifecycle from early development through post-market, especially helpful for complex devices by offering guidance on payer coverage, trial planning, and regulatory strategy. The last one would be Early Feasibility Studies Program. So it allows for small scale, early stage trials even when the device is not fully final or developed. This is this is critical for rare pediatric conditions where running a full blown pivotal trial immediately just isn't feasible. So, in addition to the regulatory programs, the FDA funds several pediatric device consortia or PDCs. These are nonprofit groups that support pediatric device innovation. They assist with everything from regulatory strategy to engineering, prototyping, IP protection, reimbursement planning, and clinical trial design. So each product can receive between 50,000 to 50K dollars per year, and some of the most active consortia include the Consortium for Technology and Innovation in Pediatrics, which is CTIP, Southwest National Pediatric Device Consortium, which is SWPDC, and the UCSF Stanford PDC. So these consortia also play a networking role, connecting startups with clinicians, researchers, and FDA reviewers to accelerate safe pediatric device development. So, funding is another piece of the puzzle. The burden of developing pediatric devices is high, and these public and private options help offset that. So, talking about public-private partnerships, these combine government and industry support to reduce the risk for companies developing pediatric devices. The goal is to de-risk innovation through shared investment. Then we have SBIR, STTR grants, which is SBIR is an acronym for Small Business Innovation Research, and STRR for Small Business Technology Transfer. These are non-dilutive federal grants, meaning companies don't give up the ownership in return for the funds they get. So they are offered by groups like National Institute of Health, NIH, National Institute of Children Health and Human Development, NICHD, and Department of Defense, DoD, and the Nationwide Science Foundation, NSF. And they are structured in three phases: proof of concept, development, and commercialization. Uh, and we also have private foundations or venture capital, but it is more limited for pediatric devices due to low return on investment. But nonprofit and foundation funding does exist driven innovation. Then we have building trial infrastructure. So another area to focus is clinical trial infrastructure. Programs like the System of Hospitals for Innovation and Pediatrics Medical Device, which stands for SHIPMD, aim to create national pediatric trial networks, and the FDA is funding institutional review boards, pediatric trained staff, and the systems that support multi-center trials. So these efforts also focus on clinical engagement, making sure trials are designed with end user feedback in mind. Uh, Lastly, we have real world evidence and registries. So finally, real world evidence from off-label use is now being actively used to support pediatric approvals. Systems like National Evaluation System for Health Technologies Coordinating Center, which is NEST-CC, use data from registries, EHRs, and patient-reported outcomes to expand labels or monitor safety. For example, a cryoablation device was recently expanded into adolescent use based on real world data. So key registries include PEDSnet, a national pediatric learning health system, Pediatric Information System, which is PHIS, Pediatric Epilepsy Research Collaborative, which is PERC, and the Pediatric International Deep Brain Stimulation Registry Project, which is PEDI-DBS, all of which collect vital pediatric neuromodulation outcomes. So even with the progress in regulatory pathways and real world use, there are still real limitations in the field of pediatric neuromodulation. First, we have limited clinical data, especially large or long-term studies. This makes it difficult to assess device safety and efficacy in pediatric populations. Second, the long-term effects of neuromodulation on the developing brain remain unclear. While plasticity may offer benefits, it could also lead to unintended changes, and we just don't have the research yet. Third, there's slow expansion of labeling. Even when devices are used off-label successfully, we rarely see that the real-world use translate into updated FDA indications. Lastly, we lack proven economic incentives. So there are very few case studies of successful pediatric device commercialization. So companies are hesitant to invest. So to conclude, pediatric neuromodulation holds tremendous promise, especially for children with drug-resistant neurological or pain conditions like epilepsy, dystonia, chronic pain. And yet, the reality is that most of these technologies are developed for adults, and most pediatric use today is still off-label, not because the need isn't there, but because the regulatory, ethical, financial, and technical barriers we have explored. There are promising pathways in place. Programs like HDE or Breakthrough Device Program and Pediatric Device Consortia funding are actively enabling the development of pediatric specific solutions. We are also seeing growth traction with real world evidence and clinical registries, which are already starting to support label expansion and more targeted trial planning. But there's still a long way to go. We need devices that are tailored for children, not just scaled down adult models. We need long term studies to understand how neuromodulation affects the developing brain. We need to create a real financial incentives to make pediatric innovation sustainable for manufacturers. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about the device, it's about access, equity, and giving children the same quality of care that adults already benefit from. Bridging the gap will take coordinated effort between regulators, innovators, clinicians, and families, but it's the only way to bring safe, effective neuromodulation to the children who need it the most. So, and with that, I conclude my today's presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you. I'd like to open the floor for